Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
The Floating Blob. I want to start by saying I don't believe in paranormal things. I consider myself a materialist, and I don't believe in an afterlife or hauntings or whatever. So whatever I saw, I do believe it is, or rather would be explainable if the phenomenon could have been studied. Maybe it was aliens, maybe, but that seems unlikely to me, knowing the vastness of the universe and the unlikeliness that we will ever come into contact with intelligent extraterrestrial life. But anyway, I graduated college back in 2013, middle of the recession. I spent probably 6 months putting all my efforts into finding a job in my field to basically no avail. I eventually took a terrible customer service job after I wrecked my car and didn't have enough money to get it fixed. My parents are rich and gave me a bunch of crap for doing this. I quit around April the following year with a small amount of my own money saved. So there I was, coming up on a year out of college, making minimum payments on student loans, parents tired of me living at home with them, and feeling pretty disgusted with myself. I decided to do a cross-country road trip. Mostly it was me running from my problems, and with absolutely no plan for what to do after I was done. I think mostly I wanted to see if I could get by without the safety net I had for the majority of my life. I took some minimum amount of clothes, stuffed them in a duffel bag, stole my dad's Hasselblad to take with me, and left my phone there with a note that I had left for a few weeks. This would eventually turn into months, but whatever. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about the kinds of things I got into in the time between when I left and when I stumbled upon the thing this post is actually about. But a rough overview of what happened is that I left my parents' home in southern Ohio, went south and east, drove along the Atlantic down to about Jacksonville, started moving west and slightly north after that. I blew through my money after the first month and ended up taking odd jobs in small towns. Lots of interesting stories here, but it's all irrelevant. Anyway, it's now August. I have meandered my way into the side roads of western Colorado and eastern Utah. I believe the last town I had visited was Wrangley. It was about 9 p.m., and I was looking for somewhere that was the Bureau of Land Management land where I could park and sleep for the night. Find a dirt road and figure even if this isn't Bureau of Land Management land, then no one is probably going to find me if I drive down it for like 10 minutes, then pull off. Now it's maybe 10 or 11. I read for like an hour, then started to hear a humming. I thought it might be a helicopter or truck or something. It started to get louder, and I got worried it was a cop or the owner of the land or someone who would yell at me. It didn't sound like an engine, though, really. More similar to an electrical hum, like from a power substation or something. It just kept getting louder, too. So eventually I get out of my car to try and find out what is going on. Outside my car, the noise doesn't sound as uniform as it did within my car, and it seemed to be undulating. It was very deep, like a rumble, but also sounded vocal. A little bit like a whale call, maybe. So I started moving in the direction that it was coming from. Eventually, I come into a clearing that was maybe a 3 or 4 minute walk from my car, and there's just a blob floating there. Like it's maybe 4 feet off the ground and floating there. I don't know why I wasn't more scared of it in retrospect, but it was just sitting there emitting this noise that at this point was just ebbing in and out. I could feel the vibration in my stomach. It was a little like getting a full body massage. But the blob, which was roughly spherical, basically had no reaction to me being there. Like I moved closer to it a bit and it had no real reaction. At this point, I'm just completely perplexed, but again, like totally at peace. No idea why. I might have stood there looking at it for 10 minutes before I thought I should get my camera. So I run back to the car and open the back door and dig through my bag for my dad's Hasselblad. I grab it and a roll of Portra 800 film, which I already had spooled in a film back from photos I'd been taking at night during my drives the last few months. I had, I think, 4 shots left on the roll when I grabbed it. So after another few minutes, I return to the clearing. The blob is still there, still humming, but I do notice that it looks bigger. This thing looked a lot like those floating ray tracing spheres that games will use to show off their advanced reflections, except that it wasn't actually reflective. Had a texture a bit like leather. Anyway, so this is about the time that I realized that I don't have a tripod. and it's way too dark to handhold this camera. My guess, with the moon being semi-full, is that I need a 2-second exposure time to get something where I can make out any detail. So I decide to walk back to the tree line to set the camera in between a tree trunk and branch, where it can be reasonably stable and waste one shot. The idea being that hopefully at least this photo will come out if none of the others do. The issue with taking the picture here is that it is pretty far away from the subject, so even if it did come out of it, the blood would be pretty small in the frame. So after this shot, I decided to move closer with the camera to try and get something better. As I approach, I could tell that the blob is definitely bigger than it was before. The humming stopped growing louder and seemed to be steady. I was maybe 6 feet from the thing at this point, so this is where I take the second shot. It's me hand holding it, so I just do my best to stay as still as possible and do a half-second exposure. When I click the shutter on this one, the blob snaps inward, like its diameter decreased by 1/3. That startled me and I stumbled back, landing on my ass and dropping the camera. For the first time, I think the reality of the insanity of the whole thing got to me. It also let out a higher-pitched, shorter noise that almost sounded like a squeal. I grabbed the camera, which landed near to my feet, and started to slowly move back toward the tree line. I sat there just looking at the thing for probably another 30 minutes, just observing. The blob returned roughly to its diameter from earlier, and I also noticed that it seemed to go in and out over time, not by a lot, but by enough to be noticeable if you were looking for it. I decided to try to approach the thing again. The droning had calmed down a bit, and the blob was also slightly smaller than the largest I had ever saw it. As I approached, it did seem to get a little larger. Now, in retrospect, this was probably dumb, but I did decide to reach out and touch it. It turned out not to have any real repercussions, but I had no idea what would happen. So anyway, I'm an arm's length from the thing, and I just kind of poke it with my index finger. Like not a poke where you actually try to poke into something, but more like I gently felt it with the tip of my pointer finger. It was warm to the touch and felt like skin. Not human skin, more like how I imagine an elephant or rhino's skin might feel. Very tough, very warm. There was essentially no reaction to me touching it, so I then placed my full palm on it. Through my palm, I could really feel these vibrations from the droning. It was incredibly calming. That is when I noticed that there was another one, a second blob slightly smaller, about 4 feet from the first one. There was not, however, a new droning, still only one. I took my palm off of the first one and walked over to where the second was. I was at that point directly between the two, I think. Between the two, the sensation of the vibration was, again, immensely calming. The camera, which I was holding in my left hand, I decided to sit down on the ground between the two so that I could do what I think was the craziest thing during this experience. I reached out my 2 hands between the blobs and touched both with my full palms. I have no idea how long I stayed like that. It may have been as little as 10 minutes or as long as 2 hours. Eventually, I snapped myself out of it and picked up my camera again. I decided to get an appropriate distance back from the blobs and try another photo. I cocked the shutter and got ready to see what kind of reaction it gave. When I fired the shutter this time, there wasn't a squeal, and the blobs didn't contract like the first time, at least not at first. What did happen was that there was more of a loud whoosh sound. Air started blowing out from the direction of the blobs. Several more appeared, and they actually all grew quite a lot until they all joined into a much larger diameter single blob than before. It was so large that it extended into the ground at this point. It was as tall as some of the surrounding trees, but then it rapidly shrank, again splitting into multiple blobs. Then all the blobs except the original disappeared, and the original was the last one there, and was rapidly shrinking in diameter. I tried to set up the last shot quickly, but before I could, the original blob shrank completely out of existence. The droning, too, is gone now. I walked over to where the blobs were to see what they had done to the ground, but there was nothing, which is the strangest part, I think. I saw this thing intersect the ground, and there was no trace of it. Not a blade of grass out of place. I stayed there for maybe 30 more minutes to see if it came back, but no such luck. When I got back to my car, I locked my doors and tried to sleep for maybe an hour before I gave up and started to walk back to the site where it all happened. I noticed the sky getting lighter and that it seemed like dawn was close. which seemed very strange to me because I did not think the entire ordeal had taken that amount of time. In the clearing, there was still nothing. Looked completely normal. I walked into the center about where I think the blob was and just laid down. I slept for a while, maybe an hour or two. When I woke up, there was a really nice view of a valley that the clearing sort of overlooked. I decided to use the last frame of film on the roll for that. When I got back my car and turned it on, the radio said it was around 5:30 a.m. As I got back onto a main road and was able to stop into a small town, I don't remember which one, for gas and some food, I noticed that the clock in my car didn't match the clock in the gas station. It was like 3 hours off, which is complete insanity. The last thing about this story is that my film, like I'm not just talking about the roll I had in the camera that night with me, but also all the ones in my car suffered from extreme radiation damage. The effect was very similar to what happens when you leave film in a hot car, or take it through an airport X-ray scanner one too many times.
On that day, July 17th, 2017, I was relaxing at home in Santa Cruz, California, when I noticed some movement across the street from my kitchen window. It's a small side street with lots of large trees. It was hard to tell what I was seeing at first because they appeared to have some sort of camouflage, but they looked like black SWAT uniforms with small yellow lettering, once I was able to get a better view. They were up in a tree, very well hidden by the leaves, and I was only really able to see them when they moved. It was apparent when they moved as opposed to the wind because only a small section of a branch would vibrate. I was startled and anxious because they were looking toward my house, and I first thought they had me under surveillance or something and couldn't understand what was going on. I watched them in the tree for at least 5 to 10 minutes, and I was crouched low, looking through a cutout in my fence. They seemed to spot me at some point, and some kind of faint beeping sound started, like an alarm on a radio or walkie-talkie. They then began trying to slowly and secretly climb down ropes that I could see being controlled by a man high in the tree wearing a blue jacket. They dropped out of sight behind the neighbor across the street's fence. So, this was all weird enough, but what happened next was absolutely mind-blowing. I was trying to see where they went behind the fence and noticed something very tall at the back of the driveway of their next-door neighbor. Their driveway extends behind their house into the backyard. I realized I was looking at an unbelievably tall woman with very blonde, long hair. She had a sort of grey and white jumpsuit on, with a strange-looking oval back covering that went around the top of her head and all the way down to her feet. It was only solid in the back and was whitish in color with a patterned border around the edge. It didn't really look like fabric, but I couldn't tell what it was. Her eyes were extremely large. She stood very still, but moved slightly, and there seemed to be a shorter humanoid shape wearing the same color jumpsuit moving around rather wildly at her feet. But the shadow of the fence made it hard to see that part. The sunlight was good and bright, and the only obstruction was some sparse shadowing from tree leaves. Not really sure what I was looking at, I looked back to where the black-wearing tree climbers had been and saw that suddenly there was now a short, skin-colored something standing behind their fence. The fence is a lattice pattern, so there are a good many holes you can see through. It was too short to be seen over the top of the fence, but I could see a very large face with a deeply wrinkled forehead and eyes that almost looked like they were made of some kind of glitter. They were very large and somewhat rounder than what people usually describe as alien eyes. I could see that it was looking right at me, so not knowing what else to do, I waved at it. It then reached a hand with very long bony fingers through the fence lattice and waved back. It waved a couple more times, stopping in between waves. I was so stunned that I had to look away and shake my head to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. When I looked back, it had stopped waving and was a little further back from the fence. It seemed like a good entity, whatever it was. Even though I was seeing from across the street through 2 fences, I could see it quite well. Things somehow got even weirder after that. I decided to lie down for a minute, glancing back to where the massive woman had been, but there didn't seem to be anyone there anymore. I went up into my little loft, which has several skylights under a giant live oak tree. I stared at the tree trying to process what I had just witnessed, when I noticed a couple of branches quivering like the ones the covert ops guys had been shaking. I expected to see more of those creepy agents, but instead strained to see a much smaller creature climbing expertly up into the high branches. It was difficult to see it clearly because it seemed to be a dusty grey-green color, much like the bark and leaves of the tree. It seemed to have textured skin, possibly scaly, and it had an angular face with teeny tiny little projections like little horns or possibly short antennae. It has a small mouth that looks full of sharp teeth. Its eyes were quite large and dark. It had a humanoid build but was short. I stared at this for many minutes, wondering what the hell was going on. Then I caught sight of some slight movement on other branches and saw two more of the same creatures climbing easily up the tall tree. They reached a high-up branch that was big enough to lie on. The light, once they stopped moving much, was not ideal, and it was hard to see them when they were sitting still. In the shade of the branches, it looked like an even smaller, dark green creature was working on the grey-colored one's back somehow. It looked like a massage to me. I watched until my neck was too painful from looking up to continue. When I looked back a little later, the branches were empty. This was all preceded by an unnerving experience late the night before. I got up to get water and glanced at the driveway neighbor's window. Inside, I saw an unnaturally gangly figure that was bluish light gray. It was staring out of their window directly at me, which caught me off guard, and I let out a little shriek. I walked from the kitchen into the bathroom and looked again, seeing that its eyes followed where I was. I called my boyfriend in fear and told him what I was seeing. He was just excited while I was scared. I thought that would be the end of it when I went to bed, but the next day was even crazier. I wish I had a way to find out what was going on. There was also a very small orb darting about the branches of the oak tree, and any time it would graze a twig, it would give a little shake. I've never seen a bird or bug or other flying life form move in that manner. I attest that this is all true, and I described it to the best of my knowledge. I've never seen anything like this before, and really would like to know what was going on, and if it is real, why so many different kinds of extraterrestrials were in my neighborhood.
This event took place when I was 18 years old and living in Spring Creek, Nevada. It's a very small town about 10 miles from Elko, Nevada. I was staying at my friend's aunt's house, and that is where I was living at the time. I slept on the couch in the living room because there weren't enough rooms at her house. One night I woke up at 3 a.m. for no reason. I looked right into the kitchen from the couch and noticed the time. Then I swung my head to my left and instantly jumped and froze with fear as I noticed the living room door was open so wide it was touching the wall. Standing in the living room doorway were 3 4-foot-tall beings with heads too large for their bodies. One was standing in front, and the other 2 were about 1 foot behind the front one and on the left and right side. There was a light coming from behind them, shining through the door, that was a white colour with a tint of light blue. I was unable to make out their facial features due to the lighting coming from only the back of them, but there was no question they were there, standing clear as day. As soon as I noticed them and jolted from fear, the front one zoomed over to me on the couch. I didn't notice how it moved because it was so quickly standing over me as I remained laying there. I looked up at it and, of course, my adrenaline was pumping. I felt a little hand rub my cheek in a comforting way, and in my head, I instantly told myself, it's okay. Not even kidding, the second it touched my cheek, my adrenaline stopped, and my heart rate went back to normal almost instantaneously, which I still don't know how that is even possible. It's like it controlled my emotions by touching my cheek. The feeling I got when it touched my cheek was overwhelming love and comfort and happiness. It's like it was telling me to not be worried and it meant no harm. The weirdest thing is that I even looked up at it and smirked with comfort and knew it was okay to go back to sleep. Who would go back to sleep with some unknown being standing right above them? The whole encounter lasted only a minute. I am now 30 years old, and ever since then I have had roughly 5 to 6 UFO sightings that are undoubtedly UFOs, based on them defying all physics. The first UFO I witnessed was with about 8 other strangers at a gas station in the same small town, and I was 18 years old as well. I just can't recall if it was before this encounter with extraterrestrials or after. I still have a never-ending curiosity and still feel blessed to have had the experience with extraterrestrials that I have. I am sitting at work at this moment and felt compelled to share this with you, even though it was so long ago. It feels great to make others aware that they are not alone, and I too know what is out there.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.
There's also a Rumble archive as a backup.